Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Swiss Family Robinson, and we're starting today with Chapter 6, A Troop of Animals in Cork Jackets. Early the next morning, though it was scarcely light, I mounted the vessel, hoping to gain a sight of our beloved companions through a telescope. Fritz prepared a substantial breakfast of biscuit and ham, but before we sat down, we recollected that in the captain's cabin we had seen a telescope of a much superior size and power, and we speedily conveyed it to the deck. While this was doing, the brightness of the day had come on. I fixed my eye to the glass and discovered my wife coming out of the tent and looking attentively toward the vessel, and at the same moment perceived the motion of the flag upon the shore. A load of anxiety was thus taken from my heart, for I had the certainty that all were in good health and had escaped the dangers of the night. "Now that I have had a sight of your mother," said I to Fritz, "my next concern is for the animals on board. Let us endeavor to save the lives of some of them at least, and to take them with us." "Would it be possible to make a raft to get them all upon it, and in this way get them to shore?" asked Fritz. "But what a difficulty in making it, and how could we induce a cow, an ass, and a sow either to get upon a raft, or, when there, to remain motionless and quiet? The sheep and goats one might perhaps find means to remove, they being of a more docile temper. But for the larger animals, I am at a loss how to proceed." "My advice, father, is to tie a long rope round the sow's neck and throw her without ceremony into the sea. Her immense bulk will be sure to sustain her above water, and we can draw her after the boat." "Your idea is excellent, but unfortunately it is of no use but for the pig, and she is the one I care the least about preserving." "Then here is another idea, father. Let us tie a swimming jacket round the body of each animal, and contrive to throw one and all into the water. You will see that they will swim like fish, and we can draw them after us in the same manner." "Right, very right, my boy. Your invention is admirable. Let us therefore not lose a moment in making the experiment." We hastened to the execution of our design. We fixed a jacket on one of the lambs and threw it into the sea, and full of anxious curiosity, I followed the poor beast with my eyes. He sank at first, and I thought him drowned, but he soon reappeared, shaking the water from his head, and in a few seconds he had learned completely the art of swimming. After another interval, we observed that he appeared fatigued, gave up his efforts, and suffered himself to be borne along by the course of the water, which sustained and conducted him to our complete satisfaction. "Victory!" exclaimed I, hugging my boy with delight. "These useful animals are all our own. Let us not lose a moment in adopting the same means with those that remained, but take care not to lose our little lamb." Fritz now would have jumped into the water to follow the poor creature, who was still floating safely on the surface, but I stopped him till I had seen him tie on a swimming jacket. He took with him a rope, first making a slip knot in it, and soon overtaking the lamb, threw it round his neck and drew him back to our boat, and then took him out of the water. We next got 4 small water butts. I emptied them and then carefully closed them again. I united them with a large piece of sailcloth, nailing one end to each cask. I strengthened this with a second piece of sailcloth, and this contrivance I destined to support the cow and the ass, 2 casks to each, the animal being placed in the middle with a cask on either side. I added a thong of leather stretching from the casks across the breast and haunches of the animal to make the whole secure, and thus in less than an hour both my cow and my ass were equipped for swimming. It was next the turn of the smaller animals. Of these, the sow gave us the most trouble. We were first obliged to put a muzzle on her to prevent her biting, and then we tied a large piece of cork under her body. The sheep and goats were more accommodating, and we had soon accoutred them for our adventure. And now we had succeeded in assembling our whole company on the deck in readiness for the voyage. We tied a cord to either the horns or the neck of each animal, and to the other end of the cord a piece of wood similar to the mode used for making nets, that it might be easy for us to take hold of the ropes and so draw the animal to us if it should be necessary. We began our experiment with the ass by conducting him as near as possible to the brink of the vessel and then suddenly shoving him off. He fell into the water, and for a moment disappeared, but we soon saw him rise, and in the action of swimming between his 2 barrels, with a grace which really merited our commendation. Next came the cow's turn, and as she was infinitely more valuable than the ass, my fears increased in due proportion. The ass had swum so courageously that he was already at a considerable distance from the vessel, so that there was sufficient room for our experiment on the cow. We had more difficulty in pushing her overboard, but she reached the water in as much safety as the ass had done before. She did not sink so low in it, and was no less perfectly sustained by the empty barrels, and she made her way with gravity, and, if I may so express it, a sort of dignified composure. According to this method, we proceeded with our whole troop, throwing them one by one into the water, where by and by they appeared in a group, floating at their ease, and seemingly well content. The sow was the only exception. She became quite furious, set up a loud squalling, and struggled with so much violence in the water that she was carried to a considerable distance, but fortunately in a direction toward the landing place we had in view. We had now not a moment to lose. Our last act was to put on our cork jackets, and then we descended without accident through the cleft, took our station in the boat, and were soon in the midst of our troop of quadrupeds. We carefully gathered all the floating bits of wood, and fastened them to the stern of the machine, and thus drew them after us. When everything was adjusted and our company in order, we hoisted our sail, which soon filling with a favorable wind, bore us toward the land. Proud of the success of so extraordinary a feat, we were in high spirits and seated ourselves in the tubs, where we made an excellent dinner. I was occupied in thinking of those I had left on land when a sudden exclamation from Fritz filled me with alarm. "Oh, heavens!" cried he, "we are lost! A fish of an enormous size is coming up to the boat." "And why lost?" said I, half angry and yet half partaking of his fright. "Be ready with your gun, and the moment he is close upon us we will fire upon him." He had nearly reached the boat, and with the rapidity of lightning had seized the foremost sheep. In this instant Fritz aimed his fire so skillfully that the balls of the gun were lodged in the head of the monster, which was an enormous shark. The fish half turned himself round in the water and hurried off to sea, leaving us to observe the lustrous smoothness of his belly, and that as he proceeded he stained the water red, which convinced us that he had been severely wounded. The animal now being out of sight and our fears appeased, I resumed the rudder, and as the wind drove us straight toward the bay, I took down the sail and continued rowing till we reached a convenient spot for our cattle to land. I had then only to untie the ends of the cords from the boat, and they stepped contentedly on shore. Our voyage thus happily concluded, we followed their example. Ernest and Jack now ran to the boat and began to shout their admiration of the mast, the sail, and the flag, desiring their brother to explain to them how all the things they saw had been effected, and what he himself did of them. In the meantime, we began to unpack our cargo, while Jack stole aside and amused himself with the animals, took off the jackets from the sheep and goats, bursting from time to time into shouts of laughter at the ridiculous figure of the ass who stood before them adorned with his 2 casks and his swimming apparatus, and braying loud enough to make us deaf. By and by I perceived with surprise that Jack had round his waist a belt of metal covered with yellow skin, in which were fixed 2 pistols. "In the name of heaven," exclaimed I, "where did you procure this curious costume which gives you the look of a smuggler?" "From my own manufactory," replied he, "and if you cast your eyes upon the dogs you will see more of my specimens." Accordingly, I looked at them and perceived that each had on a collar similar to the belt round Jack's waist, with, however, the exception of the collars being armed with nails, the points of which were outwards, and exhibited a formidable appearance. "And is it you, Mr. Jack," cried I, "who have invented and executed these collars and your belt?" "Yes, father, they are indeed my invention, with a little of my mother's assistance when it was necessary to use the needle." "But where did you get the leather and the thread and the needle?" "Fritz's jackal furnished the first," answered my wife, "and as to the last, a good mother of a family is always provided with them. Then have I not an enchanted bag from which I draw out such articles as I stand in need of? So if you have a particular fancy for anything, you have only to acquaint me with it." I tenderly embraced her to express my thanks for this effort to amuse by so agreeable a raillery, and Jack too came in for his share both of the caresses and our hearty commendations. Perceiving that no preparations were making for supper, I told Fritz to bring us the Westphalia ham. The eyes of all were now fixed upon me with astonishment, believing that I could only be in jest, when Fritz returned, displaying with exultation a large ham which we had begun to cut in the morning. "A ham!" cried one and all. "A ham, and ready dressed! What a nice supper we shall have!" said they, clapping their hands to give a hearty welcome to the bearer of so fine a treat. "It comes quite in the nick of time, too," interrupted I, "for to judge by appearances, a certain careful steward I could name seems to have intended to send us supperless to bed, little thinking, I suppose, that a long voyage by water is apt to increase the appetite." "I will tell you presently," replied my wife, "what it was that prevented me from providing a supper for you all at an early hour. Your ham, however, makes you ample amends, and I have something in my hand with which I shall make a pretty side dish. In the twinkling of an eye, you shall see it make its entrance." She now showed us about a dozen of turtles' eggs, and then hurried away to make an omelet of some of them. "Look, father," said Ernest. if they are not the very same which Robinson Crusoe found in his island. See, they are like white balls covered with a skin like wetted parchment. We found them upon the sands along the shore." "Your account is perfectly just, my dear boy," said I. "By what means did you make so useful a discovery?" "Oh, that is part of our history," interrupted my wife, "for I also have a history to relate when you will be so good as to listen to it." "Hasten then, my love, and get your pretty side dish ready, and we will have the history for the dessert. In the meantime, I will relieve the cow and the ass from their jackets. Come along, boys, and give me your help." I got up, and they all followed me gaily to the shore. We were not long in effecting our purpose with the cow and the ass, who were animals of a quiet and kind temper. But when it was the sow's turn, our success was neither so easy nor so certain. For no sooner had we untied the rope than she escaped from us and ran so fast that none of us could catch her. The idea occurred to Ernest of sending the two dogs after her, who caught at her ears and sent her back, while we were half deafened with the hideous noise she made. At last she suffered us to take off her cork jacket. We now laid the accoutrements across the ass's back and returned to the kitchen, our slothful Ernest highly delighted that we were likely in future to have our loads carried by a servant. In the meantime, the kind mother had prepared the omelet and spread a tablecloth on the end of the cask of butter, upon which she had placed some of the plates and silver spoons we had brought from the ship. The ham was in the middle, and the omelet and the cheese opposite to each other, and altogether made a figure not to be despised by the inhabitants of a desert island. By and by, the two dogs, the fowls, the pigeons, the sheep, and all the goats had all assembled round us, which gave us something like the air of sovereigns of the country. When we had finished our repast, I bade Fritz present our company with a bottle of Canary wine, which we had brought from the captain's cabin, and I desired my wife to indulge us with the promised history. Chapter 7. Second Journey of Discovery performed by the mother of the family. "You pretend," said my wife with a little malicious smile, "to be curious about my history, yet you have not let me speak a single word in all this time. But the longer a torrent is pent up, the longer it flows when once let loose. Now then, that you are in the humor to listen, I shall give vent to a certain little movement of vanity which is fluttering at my heart. Not, however, to intrude too long upon your patience, we will skip the first day of your absence, in the course of which nothing new took place. But this morning, when I was made happy by the sight of your signal, and had set up mine in return, I looked about before the boys were up, in hopes to find a shady place where we might now and then retire from the heat of the sun. But I found not a single tree. This made me reflect a little seriously on our situation. It will be impossible, said I to myself, to remain in this place with no shelter but a miserable tent, under which the heat is even more excessive than without. Courage, then, pursued I. My husband and my eldest son are at this moment employed for the general good. Why should not I be active and enterprising also? Why not undertake with my youngest sons to do something that shall add some one comfort to our existence? I will pass over with them to the other side of the river, and with my own eyes examine the country respecting which my husband and Fritz have related such wonders. I will try to find out some well-shaded, agreeable spot in which we may all be settled. I assembled the boys round me and informed them of my plans for an excursion, and you may believe I heard nothing like a dissenting voice. They lost not a moment in preparing themselves. They examined their arms, their game bags, looked out the best clasp knives, and cheerfully undertook to carry the provision bags, while I, for my share, was loaded with a large flask of water and a hatchet, for which I thought it likely we might find a use. I also took the light gun which belongs to Ernest, and gave him in return a carbine, which might be loaded with several balls at once. We took some refreshment, and then sallied forth, attended by the two dogs for our escort. We arrived at the place at which you had crossed the river, and succeeded in passing over, though not without difficulty. After having filled my flask with river water, we proceeded on our way till we had reached to the top of the hill which you described to us as so enchanting, and where I partook of the pleasure you had experienced. In casting my eyes over the vast extent before me, I had observed a small wood of the most inviting aspect. I had so long sighed for a little shade that I resolved to bend our course toward it. For this, however, it was necessary to go a long way through a strong kind of grass, which reached above the heads of the little boys, an obstacle which, on trial, we found too difficult to overcome. We therefore resolved to walk along the river, and turn at last upon the wood. We found traces of your footsteps, and took care to follow them, till we had come to a place which seemed to lead directly to it. But here again we were interrupted by the height and thickness of the grass, which nothing but the most exhausting endeavors could have enabled us to get through. On a sudden, we perceived a large bird rising from the thickest part of the grass and mounting in the air. Each of the boys prepared to fire, but before they could be ready, the bird was out of reach of shot. Ernest was bitterly disappointed and instantly exchanged the gun for the carbine I had given him, crying, "What a pity! If I had had but the lightest gun, if the bird had not got away so fast, I would lay any wager I should have killed him." "The mischief was, no doubt, that you did not let him know beforehand that it was your pleasure he should wait till you could be quite ready," observed I, laughing. "But, mother, how could I possibly suppose that the bird could fly away in less than a twinkling of an eye? Ah, if one would but come at this very moment!" A good sportsman, Ernest, always holds himself in readiness, this being, as I understand, one of his great arts. But as the opportunity is gone, let us look for the place in the grass from which he mounted. We may judge at least of his size by the mark he will have left there. The boys all scampered away to the place where suddenly a second bird, exactly like the first, except that he was a little larger, rushed out with a great noise and mounted above their heads. The boys remained stupid with astonishment, following him with their eyes and open mouths without speaking a word, while for my own part I could not help laughing heartily. "Oh, such fine sportsmen as we have here!" cried I. "They will never let us be in want of game, I plainly perceived. Ah, if one would but come at this very moment!" We now minutely examined the place from which the birds had mounted, and found a kind of large nest formed of dry plants, of clumsy workmanship. The nest was empty with the exception of some broken shells of eggs. I inferred from this that their young had lately been hatched, and observing at this moment a rustling motion among some plants of shorter growth, at some distance from the spot on which we stood, I concluded that the young covey were scampering away in that direction, but as the motion soon ceased, we had no longer a guide to conduct us to their retreat. We next reached a little wood. A prodigious quantity of unknown birds were skipping and warbling on the branches of the trees without betraying the least alarm at our vicinity. The boys wanted to fire on them, but this I absolutely forbade, and with the less scruple as the trees were of so enormous a height as to be out of gunshot reach. "No, my dear husband, you cannot possibly form an idea of the trees we now beheld. You must somehow have missed this wood, or so extraordinary a sight could not have escaped your observation. What appeared to us at a distance to be a wood was only a group of about 14 of them, the trunks of which seemed to be supported in their upright position by arches on each side, these arches being formed by the roots of the tree. Jack climbed with considerable trouble upon one of these arch-formed roots, and with a pack-thread in his hand measured the actual circumference of the tree itself. He found that it measured more than 15 bracts. The bract is equal to 22 inches and a half. I made 32 steps in going round one of those giant productions at the roots, and its height from the ground to the place where the branches begin to shoot may be about 36 bracts. The twigs of the tree are strong and thick, its leaves moderately large in size, and bearing some resemblance to the hazel tree of Europe. But I was unable to discover that it bore any fruit. The large breadth of shade which presented itself seemed to invite us to make this spot the place of our repose, and my predilection for it grew so strong that I resolved to go no further but to enjoy its delicious coolness till it should be time to return. I sat down in this verdant elysium with my 3 sons round me. We took out our provision bags. A charming stream, formed to increase the coolness and beauty of the scene, flowed at our feet, and supplied us with a fresh and salutary beverage. It occurred to me that if we could but contrive a kind of tent that could be fixed in one of the trees, we might safely come and make our abode here. I had found nothing in any other direction that suited us so well in every respect, and I resolved to look no further. When we had shared our dinner among us and well rested from our fatigue, we set out on our return, again keeping close to the river, half expecting to see along the shore some of the pieces or other vestiges of the vessel which the waves might have washed up. As I expected, we found there pieces of timber, poles, large and small chests, and other articles which I knew had come from the vessel. None of us, however, were strong enough to bring them away. We therefore contented ourselves with dragging all we could reach to the dry sands beyond the reach of the waves at high water. We now suddenly cast our eyes on Flora, whom we perceived employed in turning over a round substance she had found in the sands, some pieces of which she swallowed from time to time. Ernest also perceived her motions, and did us the favor, with his usual composure, to pronounce just these words: "They are turtles' eggs." We found it difficult to make Flora leave the eggs to which she had taken a great fancy. At length, however, we succeeded in collecting near 2 dozen of them, which we secured in our provision bags. When we had concluded this affair, we by accident cast our eyes upon the sea, and to our astonishment perceived a sail which seemed to be joyfully approaching toward the land. I knew not what to imagine, but Ernest exclaimed that it was you and Fritz, and we soon had the happiness of being convinced that it was indeed our well-beloved. We ran eagerly toward the river, and soon arrived at the place of your landing, when we had nothing further to do but to throw ourselves into your arms. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 8. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.